That day, none of them thought they would be looking at the sky for the last time. Friday morning, October 13, 1972. At Carrasco Airport in Montevideo, young voices echoed. The players of the Old Christians rugby team were waiting to fly to Santiago together with their families and friends, a total of 45 people, all excited, all hopeful. The plane was a Fairchild FH-227D model. Its white fuselage was shining under the sun. The pilots were experienced. The weather looked normal for that morning. But the Andes Mountains were never normal. The plane took off around noon. The young Uruguayans were joking between the seats. Some were sleeping, some were looking out the window. 20-year-old Roberto Canessa was talking with his friend Nando Parrado. His mother Eugenia and his sister Susie were also on the plane. Nando was sitting close to them. Everything was ordinary, an ordinary flight, an ordinary journey. However, as the mountains drew closer, the plane began to shake. Turbulence, first light, then stronger. The pilots were adjusting the route. Crossing the Andes was always difficult. The peaks exceeded 6,000 meters. The clouds were thick. Visibility was low. But the pilots were experienced. Everything was under control. Until control was lost. The plane suddenly crashed into a mountainside. The first impact tore off the right wing. The sound of metal, screams, darkness. The second impact ripped off the tail, along with the people inside it. The third impact split the plane in two. The fuselage slid over the snow. The scraping sound pierced the ears. Then, silence. A few seconds, or maybe a few minutes. No one knew. Time had frozen at that moment. But for the survivors, time was just beginning.
One of the first to wake up was Nando Parrado. His head was split open, blood covering his face. When he opened his eyes, he saw wreckage around him. Pieces of metal, cushions thrown from the seats, shattered glass, and people. Some were moving, some were not. Nando looked for his sister Susie. She was there, but her breathing was weak. His mother, Eugenia, however, was silent. Roberto Canessa tried to stand up with his injured leg. He was a medical student. He immediately started checking those around him. Some had broken arms, some had split heads. Blood was everywhere. But worse than that, it was cold. Outside, a snowstorm was blowing. The plane had come to rest at an altitude of 3,600 meters in the middle of glaciers. The survivors slowly began to pull themselves together. A count was made. Out of 45 people, 27 were alive. 18 had died in the crash. But this was only the beginning. On the first night, 5 more people died. Their injuries were too severe. There were no medical supplies, no medicine, only snow and cold. At night, the temperature dropped to -20 degrees. The fuselage of the plane became their only protection against the wind, but the tail was gone. The rear was open. The wind was blowing inside. The young men removed the seats and piled them at the back. They made a barricade. They covered themselves with seat cushions. They tried to keep warm by huddling together. But the real question, which no one was asking yet, was, what would they eat? Morning came. When the sun rose, the view became clear, white in every direction, mountains, glaciers, endless snow cover. There were no trees, no animals, no sounds, only the howl of the wind.
The remaining food on the plane was searched. A few chocolate bars, a few bottles of wine, some cheese, a few cans of preserved food. That was all, for 22 people. No one knew how long it would last, but no one yet knew what hunger really meant. In the first days, there was hope. The plane's radio was not working, but rescue teams would come. They would definitely come. When the weather improved, helicopters would arrive. They just had to wait. Gustavo Zerbino found a radio. The batteries were weak, but it worked. When evening came, they listened to a news broadcast. A voice came through, Spanish. It was talking about rescue operations. Their hopes grew. But on the 8th day, another piece of news came over the radio. The search for the Uruguayan plane lost in the Andes has been suspended. It is believed that there are no survivors. Silence. No one spoke. No one cried. They just stared at each other, at the snow, at the mountains. Rescue was not coming. No one was looking for them anymore. Now they would either save themselves or die here. That night, a young man named Antonio Balbi stood up. "Someone has to go," he said. "Someone has to go down the mountain, bring help." Some agreed. Some objected. They had no strength to walk, but there was no other choice. Nando Parrado was still watching over his sister. Susie was growing weaker. Every breath was more difficult. His mother was dead. His sister was dying too. Something inside Nando had broken, but at the same time, something had awakened. An anger, a determination. Death would not take anyone else from him. Food began to run out. On the 9th day, the last chocolate was eaten. The last can was opened. Now only snow remained. They melted the snow and drank it. But snow gave no energy. It only quenched thirst. Their bodies were slowly wasting away. Roy Harley went outside the plane and surveyed the area. Maybe he could find something to eat. Maybe there was something in the luggage, but there was nothing. Under the snow, there was only metal and glass. On the 11th day, the first argument began. Roberto Canessa was talking in a corner with a group of friends. Their voices were low but tense. Carlitos Paez joined them, then Gustavo Zerbino, then the others. What was being discussed were things they could hardly believe, but they were things that had to be done to survive. Because outside the plane, dead bodies were lying there, frozen in the snow, preserved, and inside them, there was protein. No one said it outright, but everyone was thinking it. The medical students knew the human body was made of protein, fat, and minerals. Hunger was eating the body. Muscles were wasting away. Organs were weakening. If they did not take in calories, they would all die within a week. But could one human eat another human? Would religion allow it? Would morality allow it? Would conscience allow it? The answer here, on this mountain, in this desperation, was unclear. Gustavo Zerbino was the son of a priest's family. He was close to the church. His faith was strong, but he also wanted to survive. Jesus gave his body and his blood, he said. Maybe this, too, is a kind of sacred gift. Some cried. Some silently nodded their heads. Others went straight outside. And the one who took the first step was Roberto Canessa. He went outside. He approached a body lying in the snow. He knew him. He had been a teammate, but he was no longer that. Now he was only a source of food. He took out a knife. It was actually a piece of glass. His hand was shaking. He tried once. He couldn't. He pulled back. Then he tried again. This time he succeeded. He carried it inside. No one looked, but everyone knew. A small piece was placed on the display case. No one spoke. They just stared. Then Carlitos Paez reached out his hand. He took it, brought it to his mouth, swallowed. He almost vomited, but he managed to swallow. Then the others, one by one, some crying, some closing their eyes, but to survive, only to survive, because the Andes Mountains did not recognize mercy. At night, the wind grew even harsher. Inside the plane, the young men were lying by side. They could no longer sleep, but they were alive. Nando Parrado was sitting beside his sister, Susie. He was holding her hand. "We will endure," he said. "We will get out of here." But Susie did not answer. Her breathing had slowed. The next morning, Susie Parrado died. Nando did not scream. He did not cry. He just stared. He stared for a long time. Then he stood up and went outside. He looked at the mountain, the endless, white, merciless mountain. And at that moment, a decision formed inside him. I will cross this mountain, and I will save you. But before he could do that, the mountain had one more surprise. On the 16th night, a roar came from the sky. First from afar, then closer, a rumble, an avalanche. A mass of snow rolled down the mountainside, fast, uncontrollably, and straight toward the plain. By the time those inside heard the sound, it was already too late. The wave of snow engulfed the plain. It blocked the openings, filled the inside. The air was cut off. Darkness fell. Panic began. And 8 more people died that night, suffocating. But the real question was this: how would those who remained survive after the avalanche? After the avalanche passed, the silence was heavier. Snow had filled the inside of the plane. In the first few minutes, no one understood what had happened. There was only darkness, only cold, and the inability to breathe. Some were buried under the snow. Some were on top. In panic, they were digging. Hands were desperately trying to break through the mass of snow. Coach Inciarte was trapped under the snow. He couldn't breathe. His eyes were closed, but his mind was awake. Is this my grave? He thought. Then a hand reached down. Roy Harley pulled him up. Air. Finally, air. When a count was made, the truth was revealed. 8 more people had died. They had suffocated in the avalanche. Among them was Liliana Methal. She was 35 years old, the only adult woman in the group, a source of hope. She was gone. The number of survivors had dropped to 19. The inside of the plane was no longer a place to live. Snow covered everything. The walls had collapsed. The air holes were blocked. Living space had shrunk. But worse than that, they were in shock. The avalanche had crushed not only their bodies, but their souls. But the survivors were still alive, and that meant something. Roberto Canessa began clearing the piles of snow. Others joined him, not with shovels, but with their hands, with pieces of metal. It took hours, but in the end, they opened a small living space. It wasn't wide enough, but it was enough to live. When night came, they tried to sleep by huddling together. Conversations had become fewer. Hope had diminished, but the instinct to survive was still strong. Nando Parrado buried his sister's body under a pile of snow next to his mother. He had now lost 2 people, but he had not lost himself. He murmured, "I will not die here. I will get out of here. I will return to my father," because his father, Celer Parrado, was still waiting in Montevideo, waiting for his son, his daughter, his wife.
But he didn't know. The world believed them dead. The search had been called off. Funerals had been held. Families were mourning. But Nando was not dead, and he would not accept being dead. On the 21st day, a plan was made. Gustavo Zerbino, Antonio Balbi, and a few others gathered. "Someone has to walk," they said. "We have to reach Santiago, or a settlement. If we stay here, we will die." But the problem was that walking seemed impossible. The mountains were steep. The snow was deep and dangerous. They had no proper shoes. Their clothes were torn and thin. There was no map, no compass, only white, endless white. Still, some decided to try. The first team consisted of 3 people: Nando Parrado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Tintin Vicentin. Preparations began. Everything on the plain was searched: fabrics, cushions, belts. They used everything. They made crampon-like shoes. They made backpacks from scraps. They made snow goggles. Food? Only meat, the flesh of their dead friends. They cut it into small pieces and put it into bags. On the 25th day, the first attempt began. Early in the morning, the 3 of them left the plain. Those who remained watched them. Some prayed. Some watched in silence. Nando turned back one last time. "We will return," he said. "We will bring help." And they began to walk. The first hour was hard. The second hour was harder. The snow reached up to their knees. Every step was a struggle. The wind whipped their faces. The sun burned their eyes. But they knew that if they stopped, they would freeze. In the afternoon, they climbed a slope. When they reached the summit, they did not see the view they had hoped for. They had hoped to see the plain, or a valley, a river, a road, but there was only another mountain, and beyond it, another one, and another one beyond that, forever. Antonio dropped to his knees. "It will never end," he said. "There are mountains forever." Nando looked at him. "Then we will walk forever." But that day they could not walk any farther. Night was approaching. The temperature was dropping. They had to turn back, or they would freeze. They turned back. When they reached the plain, those who remained looked at them with disappointment. "What did you find?" someone asked. Nando only shook his head. "Mountains," he said. "Only mountains." After that night, hope diminished even more. Days turned into weeks. They no longer kept track of the calendar. Time was no longer a number, but a feeling. Fatigue, hunger, cold, hopelessness. These were the measures of time. On the 30th day, one more person died. Arturo Noguera. His wounds had become infected. There was no medicine, no antibiotics. There was only snow and cold. His body could not endure it. The number of survivors became 18, but those who remained were now different.
There was less talking, no laughter, no jokes. There was only survival. Waking up in the morning was a gain. Falling asleep at night was a miracle. Every breath was an act of resistance. Roberto Canessa began keeping a diary. In a small notebook, he noted each day, but what he wrote became monotonous. Today we survived. Tomorrow we will survive as well. What else could he write? On the 45th day, the radio was turned on again. The batteries were almost dead, but it was still working. A piece of news came through. It was talking about the World Cup final. Uruguay had won. Some smiled. The world is still turning, someone said. It didn't stop for us. It was a strange consolation. The world had forgotten them, but the world was still there. Life was still going on. Maybe they could go on too. But to go on, they needed energy, and energy was coming from only one place. On the 50th day, a new argument began. Food was under control. Each day, a fixed amount was eaten, but some wanted more. If we don't eat more, we'll grow weaker, one said. If we grow weaker, we won't be able to walk. Others objected. If we eat more, the food will run out. If it runs out, we will all die. A fight was about to break out, but Gustavo Cerbino stepped in. No one will eat more. No one will starve. We will share equally until the end. Because here, solidarity was more important than survival itself. On the 61st day, Nando Parrado stood up again. I will try again, he said. This time I will go farther. This time I will not come back. Either I bring help or I die. Roberto Canessa wanted to join him. I'll come with you, he said. The two of us are stronger. Preparations began, but this time they were done more carefully. More food was prepared. More layers of clothing were added. Something like a sleeping bag was made, because this time there was no return. On the 62nd day, the final journey began. Nando and Roberto looked at their friends one last time. I will come back to see you, Nando said, but this time by helicopter. They laughed, but there was fear in their eyes. What if they didn't return? What if they got lost? What if they froze to death? But they did not ask questions, because there was no other option. And the two men began walking through the white desert. On the first day, they walked 10 kilometers. On the second day, 8 kilometers. On the third day, 6 kilometers. Each day they were more tired, weaker, slower. But they knew that the moment they stopped, everything would be over. On the fourth day, they climbed a mountain peak. When they reached the summit, they looked west. And there, in the distance, they saw something green. Trees, forest, life. Nando dropped to his knees. He cried, "Do you see it?" he shouted. "There is life! There is life!" Roberto looked at him. "How far is it?" Nando squinted. "Maybe 10 kilometers, maybe 20, maybe more. Can we make it? We have to." And they kept walking. On the 6th day, they found a river. Water. Fresh, cold, clean water. They drank. They washed their faces. They cried. "We are in heaven," Roberto said. "This is heaven." But they still had not reached civilization. They were still alone. On the 7th day, they saw a hut in the distance. Small, but it was a hut, man-made. Nando began to run. "There are people! There are people!" But the hut was empty, abandoned. Inside there were only old supplies, but on the wall there was a map. and on the map, a settlement was marked, only 5 kilometers away. But who would meet them in that settlement? And were the remaining 16 people still alive?
On the 8th day, Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa were walking along a riverbank. Their feet were bleeding, their shoes were torn apart, their bodies were little more than bones now, but they did not stop, because they knew every step meant life. Every step meant getting closer to their friends back at the plain. The river was leading them in the right direction, west, toward the valley, toward green, toward life. In the afternoon, they heard a sound in the distance. At first, they thought it was the wind, but it wasn't the wind. It was sharper, more regular, like a human voice. They ran, or tried to. Their legs no longer allowed them to run, but they moved faster. And then they saw him. A man, a farmer, standing on the opposite bank of the river, beside his horse. Nando shouted, "Help! Please, help!" Roberto waved his arms. He was crying, he was laughing, he was doing both at the same time. The farmer looked at them. At first he was confused. 2 men were staggering back and forth, in torn clothes, with long beards, sunken eyes, like ghosts. But they were not ghosts. They were alive, and they were speaking. The farmer rode his horse into the river. He crossed to the other bank. When he came closer, he saw their faces, and he understood. These were the people from the lost plain, the people everyone thought were dead. But they were not dead. "Where did you come from?" the farmer asked. Nando pointed to the mountains. "From there. The plane crashed. Our friends are still there. 16 people. They are still alive, but they will die. They need help." The farmer looked at the mountains. They had come from those mountains, from those peaks, from those glaciers. It was impossible. But there they were. "Come with me," he said. "We will go to the village." And he took them behind his horse. 9 kilometers later, they reached a village, Los Maitenes. The villagers were shocked when they saw them. They immediately took them inside. They gave them blankets. They gave them food. But Nando and Roberto could not eat. Their stomachs could not handle it. They could only drink water. They could only cry. The village gendarmerie post was called. A phone call was made. "We are survivors of the Andes plane crash," Nando said. "There are still 16 people on the mountain. You have to rescue them." The man on the phone fell silent. "Are you real?" "We are real. Please, there is no time. Come." Within minutes, the news spread across the world. The Chilean Air Force in Santiago mobilized. Families in Montevideo rushed to the phones. Newspapers prepared extra editions. Television stations interrupted their broadcasts. Survivors found from the Andes crash. Around the world, people gathered in front of their screens. It was impossible. 72 days, minus 20 degrees, on the top of the mountains, without food. How had they survived? But the answer had not yet been given, because they had not yet been rescued. The next morning, 2 helicopters took off. The pilots received the coordinates. Nando and Roberto gave directions. "After that peak, turn right. Go straight from there. Then you will see a valley. At the end of the valley, a white dot. That's the plane." The helicopters flew fast. They crossed over the mountains. The clouds were thick. Visibility was poor, but the pilots were experienced. They continued. And then they found it. In the middle of the white snow, a metal wreck, and around it, human figures. The first helicopter began to descend. Snow was blown by the rotor wind. It landed. The door opened, and from inside, people came out.
thin, exhausted, but alive, alive. Some were crying, some were laughing, some were just staring. They couldn't believe it. A helicopter, a real helicopter, real people, real rescue. After 72 days, their nightmare was ending. But the helicopter could not carry everyone. It could only take 6 people. So the weakest were taken first. The most injured were taken. The others waited for the second trip. As Gustavo Zerbino boarded the helicopter, he turned back. He looked at the plane, at the wreck that had been their home for 72 days. Then he looked at his friends. "I will be back very soon," he said. "We will take all of you." The helicopter took off. Those left behind waved their hands. Some knelt down, some prayed, some simply cried, because they knew this was really ending. The second helicopter arrived a few hours later. It took the rest, 16 people, all alive, all rescued. The plane wreck was left behind, silent, empty, but inside it there was so much: memories, pain, loss, and the will to survive. In Santiago, at the hospital, families gathered. Nando Parrado's father, Seller, could not hold back his tears when he saw his son. He embraced him. "My son," he said, "my son has returned." But there was sadness in Nando's eyes. "My mother and Susie," he said. "They didn't come back, Dad. They—" Seller nodded. "I know, but you came back. You are alive, and that means everything." The other families were there too. Some had found their children, some their siblings, some their friends, but some found no one. Because out of 45 people, only 16 had returned. 29 people had remained on the mountain forever. But the question was on everyone's mind. How had they survived? At the first press conference, questions poured in. Journalists extended microphones. Cameras zoomed in. "What did you eat?" someone asked. Silence. Roberto Canessa stepped forward. "There was no food," he said. "There was nothing, but we wanted to survive, and our friends gave us their bodies." Another journalist asked, "So you ate their flesh?" "Yes." The room froze. Some journalists dropped their pens. Some coughed. Some just stared. But Roberto continued. "They were our friends, but when they died, their bodies became only a source of food, and they would have wanted us to live, because we had to survive, to tell their stories." And that day, the world learned the truth. Some people declared them heroes. Some called them monsters. Some tried to understand. Some judged. But the survivors did not care, because they had returned from hell, and no one had the right to judge them anymore. The church made a statement. The papacy said, "In extreme circumstances, this act done to survive is not considered a sin, because this is not killing, but the instinct to survive." Some were relieved. Some were still opposed. But in the end, the survivors were forgiven. But forgiving themselves took longer. In the hospital at night, Nando stood by the window. He looked outside. The city lights dazzled his eyes. The sound of cars hurt his ears. Everything was too loud, too fast, too alive. "How will I return?" he asked himself. "How will I return to normal life?" Roberto came and stood beside him. "I don't know," he said, "but we must, because we must live for them, For whom? For our friends, for those who died. They could not live, but we will, for them. And that night, both of them cried quietly, because they knew when they came down from the mountain, their bodies were saved, but their souls were still trapped there. Treatments that lasted weeks and months began. Their physical wounds healed, but their psychological wounds took longer. Some were haunted by nightmares. Some withdrew from social life. Some were never the same again. But some returned stronger. Nando Parrado returned to his work, but he was a different person now, more determined, more grateful, more attached to life. Every day is a gift, he would say, and I will not waste this gift. Roberto Canessa continued studying medicine. He became a cardiologist. I want to save lives, he said, because my life was saved too. And over time, the world's interest changed. The first months were scandal, then curiosity, then admiration. Books were written, films were made, documentaries were produced. The film Alive was released in 1993. The world saw their story and understood. Survival is a choice, but it is also a burden. In 2006, the survivors came together, the 34th anniversary. When they saw each other, they said nothing. They just embraced, because the bond that connected them was stronger than ordinary friendship. We are brothers, said Gustavo Zerbino. We have a blood bond in the truest sense. They laughed, they cried, and they talked about the memories, the beautiful memories, the terrible memories, all of them. Would you go again? Someone asked. They all fell silent. Then Nando said, no. But if there had been another option, we wouldn't have gone. But there was no option. There was only survival. And today, the survivors are still alive. Some became doctors, some businessmen, some parents, some grandparents, but all of them remember what they left on that mountain. They remember their friends. They remember their losses. And every year on October 13, they come together. They look at the mountain, from a distance, in safety, but in their hearts, they are still there. Because some things never truly end, but are those who remained on the mountain still not forgotten? And was the site of that wreck ever returned to? The names of those who remained on the mountain were never forgotten. The 16 people who were rescued returned to their lives, but 29 people remained on the glaciers of the Andes. Their bodies were buried under the snow. Some bodies were never found. Of some, only traces remained. Families had held funeral ceremonies, but the graves were empty because their loved ones never came back. Only memories remained, and pain. But the survivors had made a promise. We will not forget them. We will tell their stories, and one day we will return there. The year was 1973, 1 year after the rescue. The Chilean government sent a team to the wreck site. The aim was to examine the wreckage, collect what remained, and clean the area. But the main purpose was the family's demands. They wanted the bodies of their loved ones back. The team went to the mountain by helicopter. They found the wreckage, but what they saw was horrifying. The plane was completely destroyed. Metal sheets were scattered in the snow. Seats were torn apart and strewn around, and the bodies, some were still there, frozen, preserved, but identification was almost impossible. The team did what they could. Some bodies were recovered, some were sampled, but most were left there because transporting them was too dangerous, and some families wanted their loved ones to remain on the mountain. They are at peace there, they said. Let them stay there. And the mountain became a grave. Years passed. The survivors continued with their lives, but the mountain was always on their minds. In their dreams, they saw the mountain. When they were awake, they heard the sound of the wind. Sometimes when it snowed, they remembered those days. In 1974, the first book was published. Alive, the story of the Andes survivors, written by Piers Paul Reed. The book became a worldwide phenomenon. It sold millions of copies. People read the story. They cried. They were shocked, but at the same time, they were inspired. If they could survive, I can too, they said. But some misunderstood the story. They saw only the cannibalism part. They saw the sensational aspect. They did not see the real struggle, the real pain. And the survivors had to stand against this. Press conferences were held. Interviews were given. This was not cannibalism, said Roberto Canessa. This was survival, and survival is an instinctive right. The church supported them. Psychologists supported them. But a segment of society continued to judge them. You shouldn't have done it, they said. You should have chosen to die. Nando Parrado answered this question in an interview as follows. Should we have chosen to die? If we had died, we wouldn't be here now. We wouldn't be able to tell our story. We wouldn't be able to keep our friend's memory alive. No, we would not have chosen to die, because living is always the right choice. And over time, the world accepted this too. The year was 1993. The film Alive was released. Director Frank Marshall worked together with the survivors. He listened to their stories, learned the details, and made a film. The film reflected the facts, but it also reflected the emotions: fear, hopelessness, brotherhood, the will to survive. Audiences cried in movie theaters. Some left the theater. It was very heavy, very real. But the film was effective because now people had seen their faces, they had felt their pain, and judging them had become harder. The survivors attended the film's premiere. They watched the screen. They saw themselves portrayed by actors, and once again they were overwhelmed with tears.
It's like we're living it again, said Gustavo Zerbino. Every scene is a memory. Every scene is a wound. But the film was also a form of closure, because now the world knew. It was no longer a secret. It was no longer something to be ashamed of. It was simply a survival story. The year was 1982, the 30th anniversary. The survivors came together for a documentary. They returned to the mountain for the first time 30 years later. A helicopter took them there. They descended. The snow was still there, but the wreckage had largely disappeared. Only a few pieces of metal remained, and silence. Nando Parrado walked to where the wreckage had been. He knelt down. He touched the snow. "This is the place," he said. "This was our home. 72 days."
Roberto Canessa came beside him. He placed his hand on his shoulder. They did not speak. They just looked. They looked for a long time. Then the others came as well, all 16. They formed a circle, and they said a prayer for their friends, for those they had lost, and for life. Because they knew this mountain did not kill them. On the contrary, it kept them alive. When the documentary was released, the world was shocked again. But this time, it was different. This time, there was understanding. This time, there was respect. They are heroes, said a viewer, because they challenged the impossible. But the survivors did not see themselves as heroes. We were just people who wanted to survive, said Carlitos Páez. And we did, nothing more. The year was 1912, the 40th anniversary. This time, a larger event was organized. A memorial ceremony was held in Montevideo. Thousands of people attended. The survivors went up on stage. They spoke one by one. I am Nando Parrado. I returned from that mountain because I wanted to see my father, because I wanted to live, and I am grateful to be here today. I am Roberto Canessa. I lost my friends on that mountain, but at the same time, I found humanity, because even in our darkest moments, we held on to each other. Gustavo Zerbino. On that mountain, I turned my back on God, but God never abandoned me, because I learned to see every day as a miracle. And the crowd gave a standing ovation, because now they were no longer just survivors, they were symbols, symbols of human will, symbols of the instinct to survive, and symbols of hope. The year was 2022, the 50th anniversary. The survivors were now older. Some were over 70 years old, but the mountain was still in their memories. This time, Netflix released a documentary, Society of the Snow. It was passing the story on to new generations. Young people heard this story for the first time. They were shocked, but at the same time, they were inspired. If they could do it, I can too, they said, just like others had 50 years earlier. And so the story was passed from generation to generation. Today, it is the year 2024. Some of the survivors are still alive. Others have passed away, but each one left a legacy, a story, and a message. Life is more valuable than anything, and fighting for life is always justified. Was there a return to the mountain? Yes, several times. Is the wreckage still there? No, time erased it, but the memories are still there. Did the families forgive their loved ones? Some did, some did not, but all of them tried to understand. And today, at that spot in the Andes Mountains, there is a small memorial. On it is written, "This is the place where the limits of humanity were tested. This is the place where willpower achieved victory. This is the place where death was defeated by life." And every year the survivors go there, or they go there in their minds, and for a moment they are back in those days, back in that cold, back in that fear, but at the same time, back in that strength. So today, how do the survivors live, and how did that trauma change them? The trauma never fully disappeared. Even years later, the survivors would wake up at night, sweating, gasping for air. In their dreams, they were still on that mountain, still in that cold, still trapped in that desperation. In an interview in the 1980s, Nando Parrado said, "Every night before I fall asleep, I see the mountain. Every morning when I wake up, I give thanks, because I am here. I did not die, but a part of me is still there." Roberto Canessa became a cardiologist. For years he saved hearts, but he never fully healed his own. "Every patient I look at, I see him," he said. "I see the friend I lost on that mountain, and I remember that I couldn't help him, but now I can help others." Because surviving was a gift, but it was also a responsibility. In the 1990s, the survivors founded an association called Viven, the Living. Their goal was to tell their story, motivate young people, and share lessons about survival. They visited schools, they gave conferences, they told young people, in life, anything is possible, just don't lose your faith. One student asked Nando, what was the hardest moment? Nando thought for a moment. "The moment my sister died," he said, "because at that moment I lost everything. My mother was gone, my sister was gone, and I was alone. But in that moment, I made a decision. I would not die, because I had to return to my father. I had promised him. And that promise kept him alive." In the 2000s, therapy began. Some survivors sought psychologists. Many were diagnosed with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But treatment was difficult because what they experienced was not a normal trauma, not a normal accident, not a normal loss. "People tell us the past is in the past," said Gustavo Cerbino. "But the past is with us every day. Every time I eat, I remember it. Every time I feel cold, I remember it. Every time I see my friends, I remember those we lost." And yet, they became stronger, because they had achieved the impossible. The world had believed they were dead, but they had returned. And that gave them a deep confidence, a belief that they could face any hardship in life. Carlitos Paez became a businessman. He built a successful career, but he never forgot. "The mountain taught me something," he said. "Nothing in life is more important than life itself. Not money, not fame, not success, just living." And this philosophy shaped all of them. In 2010, a mining accident occurred in Chile. 33 miners were trapped underground for 69 days. The world held its breath. A rescue operation began. And at that moment, the Andes survivors stepped in. Nando Parrado and Roberto Canessa traveled to Chile. They met with the miners' families. "Don't lose hope," they said. "We survived 72 days. They can survive too." And they did. After 69 days, all 33 miners were rescued, alive. When the first miner stepped out, he saw Nando. He embraced him. "You inspired us," he said. "We listened to your story, and we believed." Because the Andes story was not just a crash story, it was a story of hope. In 2016, a documentary crew followed the survivors. They filmed their daily lives, their families, their work, their friendships. And what they showed the world was simple. They were not broken men. They were living proof that even after unimaginable darkness, life could continue. One scene was especially powerful. Roberto Canessa was performing a heart surgery in a hospital. The operation was difficult. The patient was a young man. His heart was on the verge of stopping. But Roberto did not give up. He worked for hours, and in the end, the heart began to beat again. When the surgery was over, Roberto removed his mask. There were tears in his eyes. "I saved him," he said. "I was able to save him." Because he could never forget those he could not save on the mountain, and every successful surgery was a redemption. In 2018, Nando Parrado wrote a book, Miracle in the Andes. He told his own story in his own voice. The book broke sales records worldwide. At a book signing, a young woman approached him. "Would you sign this for me?" she said, "because your story saved me." Nando was surprised. "How?" "I had cancer. I was dying. But I read your book, and I said to myself, if those people could survive on that mountain, I can fight this disease. And I fought, and I won." Nando cried, and he signed the book. "This is the greatest reward for me," he said, because now they were not just survivors, they were carriers of hope. The year 2020, the pandemic began. The world went into lockdown. People were confined to their homes. There was fear. There was uncertainty. There was despair. And at that time, the Andes survivors released a video. "We were isolated for 72 days, they said. The world had forgotten us, but we did not forget each other, and we survived. You will survive too, because human beings are incredibly resilient." The video was watched millions of times. The comments filled up. "Thank you. You inspired us. Because of you, I found hope." And once again, the story touched people's lives. Today, in 2024, some of the survivors are still active. Some have retired. Some have passed away. But each of them left something behind, a legacy, a message, and a memory. Nando Parrado is now over 70 years old, but he still runs. He participates in marathons. "Because on that mountain, I couldn't run. Now I can, and I must." Roberto Canessa is still performing surgeries, but now more slowly. "I will retire," he says, "but first I need to save a few more hearts." Gustavo Zerbino continues giving conferences. "I will not stop telling our story," he says, "because this story must not be forgotten."
Because if it is forgotten, then those who were lost are forgotten too. And the lost, they're the most precious thing. Arturo Noguera, Liliana Metol, Eugenia Parrado, Susana Parrado, and 25 more people. All of them stayed on that mountain. All of them were a story. All of them were a life. We will not forget them, say the survivors, because they are the reason we survived. They gave us their bodies, and we will give them their stories. And so the story continues to live. In 2022, a young director made a new film, La Sociedad de la Nieve, Society of the Snow. This time it was more realistic, more brutal, more accurate. The survivors watched the film, and they cried again. "It felt like yesterday," said one. "It feels like we are still there," said another. But they are no longer there. They are here. They are alive, and that is enough. So what was the true message of this story, and what did it leave for future generations?
The message had been clear from the very beginning, but no one had fully seen it. People saw cannibalism. They saw tragedy. They saw survival, but most did not see the true message. The message was this: human beings can achieve the impossible, but not alone, together. Because on that mountain, it was not individual heroism that ensured survival. It was team spirit. It was solidarity. It was brotherhood. Nando Parrado did not come down from the mountain alone. He walked with Roberto. Roberto did not perform medical care alone. He worked with Gustavo and the others. Gustavo did not keep hope alive alone. Everyone played a role. We were a team, says Carlitos Paez. When the plane crashed, we were a rugby team, but when we came down from the mountain, we were a family. And that family never broke apart. At the 50th anniversary memorial, the 16 survivors came together. Some walked arm in arm. Some were in wheelchairs. Some used canes. They had grown old, but their bond had never weakened. When they stepped onto the stage, the crowd stood up. The applause lasted for minutes, because they were not just survivors. They were symbols of humanity, symbols of resilience. And Nando stepped up to the microphone. If we were not here, he said, the world would forget us. But we are here, and as long as we are here, we will tell the story of our friends. They continue to live within us, in every breath, in every step, in every decision. Because the dead do not truly die. They die when they are forgotten. So what was the lesson they left for future generations?
The first lesson: life is more valuable than anything. No matter how difficult it is, no matter how dark it seems, life is always worth living. Because tomorrow, everything can change. What seems hopeless today may find a way out tomorrow. If we had chosen to die on that mountain, we would not be here now, says Roberto Canessa. But we did not choose that, because life is worth fighting for. The second lesson: unity is strength. No one could have escaped that mountain alone, but together they all survived. Because while one prepared food, another treated wounds. While one slept, another kept watch. While one walked, another gave encouragement. We were a chain, says Gustavo Cerbino. If one link had broken, the entire chain would have broken. But no link broke, because we held on to each other. The third lesson: morality changes with circumstances. Under normal conditions, a human eating another human is unacceptable. But on that mountain, there was no other choice, and that did not make them monsters. On the contrary, it made them human beings following their instinct to survive. The church forgave us, says one survivor. Society forgave us. But most importantly, we forgave ourselves. Because we did not do anything wrong. We wanted to survive. And what is wrong with that? Nothing. The fourth lesson: hope is the strongest weapon. When the radio announced that the search had been called off, many fell into despair. But some kept hope alive, and that hope kept them alive. If there had been no hope, we would have died in the first week, says Nando. But there was hope, because we believed in ourselves, in each other, and in life. The fifth lesson: trauma can become a source of strength. The survivors had nightmares for years, but they also turned that trauma into power. Roberto became a doctor. Nando became a motivational speaker. Gustavo became a writer. They all transformed their pain into something meaningful.
Trauma did not break us, says Roberto. It built us, because now we know this. Even the darkest night will have a morning. And these 5 lessons spread across the world. Books were taught in schools. Films were shown in classrooms. The story was passed down through generations, and each time a new person was inspired. A young person was diagnosed with cancer. He read the Andes story. "If they could do it, I can do it too," he said. And he fought, and he won. A businessman came to the edge of bankruptcy. He watched the Andes story. "If they survived with nothing, I can start again," he said. And he started again, and he succeeded. A student failed an exam. He listened to the Andes story. "If they could endure 72 days, I can study for one more exam," he said. And he studied, and he passed. Because this story was not just a plane crash story. It was a philosophy of life. In 2023, the survivors went back to the mountain one last time. They were old now. Some could not climb. They went by helicopter, but they went. When they reached the place where the wreck had been, nothing remained. The snow had erased everything. Only memories were left. They formed a circle, 16 of them. They held each other's hands and stood in silence. The wind was blowing. Snow was falling. The mountain stood silent. Then Nando spoke. "Friends," he said, "we died here, and we were reborn here."
This mountain was our grave, but it was also our cradle, because this place taught us the value of life, and we will never forget that lesson. And they all broke down in tears, because in that moment they were young again. They were back in those days. They were afraid again, hoping again, struggling again. But at the same time, they were here. It was 2023. They were alive, and that was everything. On the way back, Roberto asked Nando, "Could you do it again?" Nando thought. "No," he said. "But back then, I didn't think I could do it either. Yet we did it, because we had to. And when people have no other choice, they can do incredible things." That was the essence of the story. Today, the Andes plane crash is one of the most well-known survival stories in the world. But it is also one of the most misunderstood, because most people only see the surface: cannibalism, tragedy, drama. But deep down, there is much more. There is love, there is brotherhood, there is sacrifice, there is courage, and most importantly, there is humanity. Because on that mountain, people showed their darkest sides, but they also showed their brightest sides. One of the survivors said years later, "They ask me, what was the worst experience of your life? But I wish they would ask me, what was the best experience of your life? Because on that mountain, I lived my worst days, but at the same time, I met the best people. I met myself, and I met life." And maybe that was the true meaning of the story. Life sometimes throws us into the deepest pits. Sometimes it takes everything from us. Sometimes it leaves us alone, helpless, hopeless. But even in those moments, there is a choice: to give up or to fight.
the survivors of the Andes chose to fight, and they won. And today, this story inspires millions of people. In books, in films, in documentaries, in conferences, everywhere.